Hi there, I'm Ashley Mertens. I'm going to be giving my midterm talk for International Environmental Organizations 332. Since the midterm was meant to have taken place during a time when we would have only covered chapters 1 through 7, I don't have any information or material that I'm going to be presenting that would have been after then. So despite where we are at now in the course on, I'm pretty sure module 12, I haven't included any examples or information between modules 7 and 12, as I wanted this to mostly cover the first half of the course as the midterm kind of required. So I have about roughly 3 major themes running through this course that I've noticed so far. And the first of those is the constant conflict between developed and developing nations, the North and the South. This is an issue that has been at play throughout most of the modules up until this point, actually especially now in modules 10, 11, and 12, we see it a lot. But we were first introduced to this issue in Module 2 when we discussed the first international environmental conferences. So in Module 1, we discussed kind of the 10 main environmental concerns that we were, as a whole in the world, facing. And in Module 2, these topics are breached on a global scale. And there's a lot of conversation amongst states about what the causes of these issues are, who might be the cause for these issues, what the solution should be, who should pay for those solutions, who should implement them, and so on and so forth. And when we start exploring this, we notice a dynamic between the North and the southern countries. There is a very big difference in the ways of life of these two different parts of the world, hemispheres. In the North, there is a lot of industrialization. We've gone through our industrial revolution. We're entering the information age. The richest countries in the world are in the Northern Hemisphere. The most science is in the Northern Hemisphere. And the Southern Hemisphere are still entering their industrial age. There is massive population growth. The most population growth happens in these areas, and these are also the poorest nations in the world that have the least access to clean water, a secure food source, just a number of things. And oftentimes there is a little bit of a tension between the two, because while the South is producing a lot of the negative consequences and harming the environment in their own way, shape, or form, whether that comes to losing biodiversity due to poaching or just habitat destruction, deforestation, desertification, climate change, all of these things are impacted by the activities of the South. But they make the argument that the North is also the highest contributor to CO2 being pumped out because of our constant use of fossil fuels. And the South, again, houses a lot of poor people. And so it's very difficult for them to see why they should be held to the same standards as the North when they have progress that needs to be made because they want to improve their society and give their people a better life. So there's a lot of resentment from the South towards the North because of the fact that they are trying to go through their industrial revolution just like the North did, and they feel like that's being impeded upon by them being expected to be held to the same environmental standards as the North, while they feel that the North is also a very, very, very big contributor just from pollution in their own way, and also the North outsourcing their environmental degradation to these southern countries by having them overuse their resources so that we can purchase them. An example is when Japan decided to preserve their national forests, but they were still importing massive amounts of timber from southern countries. So again, we can see how the southern countries are the ones that are doing the environmental degradation, but it is at the command of a northern country. So that is one of the first things that we see. This is an issue that arises again when we cover Module 4 and explore the military effects that often affect and displace poor people in these countries. Not only does militarism have a negative impact on environmental well-being, but it also negatively impacts these already struggling poor nations by bringing more environmental degradation to their place of living, and also just the basic terrible things that happen when war is happening in your home country. Module 7, though, is when this becomes the most predominant as we look at the issue of global ethics. We then become aware of the need to solve these environmental problems, but still considering the needs of the local people in poorer countries. So while it is a valiant effort to want to restore forests, restore soil, cut back on carbon dioxide emission, whatever the issue might be, it's very difficult to have that be successful when it is not taking into account the needs of the indigenous people that could potentially be displaced or lose their income as a result of whatever we are doing. A good example of this that we covered was the Ugandan land grab, where thousands of people were displaced from their homes. Granted, the land was already reserved for restoration for the forest, but still it begs the question, reforestation is important, but is it okay to be dismissive of the issues that these people in these southern countries are facing and to not take their well-being into account? Especially because they are the people that live there. They are the people that are going to be impacted most directly by the environmental degradation, going to be responsible for keeping the environment in its state. So that's something that we realize that is kind of coming into play, and again kind of highlights that issue between North and the South. So that's what I have for that first theme. The second theme that I feel like we covered, or that popped up quite often, was the complexity of applying environmental policies. In the beginning part of this course, we covered the issue about there being no main global legal body that creates and enforces law at a global level. The global community is set up where there is multiple sovereign individual nation states that have their own legal systems, their own modes of functioning, and are autonomous and self-governing for the most part. This makes it difficult to come to conclusions about how each issue should be handled, seeing as each nation has their own agenda, has their own political system, has their own constituents to answer to, and their own vested interest. The goals and agendas of us here in the United States are very different from those of the Republic of Congo. Clearly having two very, very different ideologies, people living there, societies, cultures, everything that comes into play, all of those being self-governing without kind of an umbrella of a legal body to tie it all together and implement global, across-the-board laws that everybody needs to follow, it becomes an issue. Again, going back to the issue of the North and the South, often richer, developed nations have louder voices. They have the most progress, the most money. Oftentimes, their agenda can be put in front of the agenda of poorer nations that very likely have an equal right and a vested interest in things that might not positively affect us. Nations have, as a whole, chosen to come together to come up with some way of bridging this gap and trying to solve global issues like climate change and the plethora of other environmental concerns that we've covered. Most of the states have come together and realized that this is something that, since it impacts everybody at a global level, there needs to be some steps that are taken in order to try to implement some sort of policy on a global scale in order to have some positive results. We have definitely improved a lot from where we are at. The Convention on Biodiversity, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. We're having a lot of conferences and starting to implement new bodies and new agencies to carry these things out because we are realizing that these are issues that do need to be dealt with at that level. And while we are doing that, there are still some issues that we are dealing with that are making it so we're not quite as successful as we could be in implementing environmental policy. For example, while hard law is legally binding, there is soft law, which is a lot of these declarations that don't really have any way to enforce or any way to hold these nations to a standard. It kind of becomes, again, up to the self-governing state to make that decision for its people, for itself, if they are going to abide by these agreements that were agreed upon at an international level. There is even a debate about how hard law should be enforced and carried out anyway. And another important thing, again, to the credit of our growth, is the amount of multilateral environmental agreements have grown and how many have come into effect each year. It's been getting more and more every single year. So clearly there is some progress while there is still a lot of work that needs to be done. One of the big things is that kind of leads into this last theme about there being just a wide variety of different international organizations that help bridge this gap between these multiple nation states. NGOs, we've covered them constantly. These non-governmental organizations play a really big role filling in these gaps between that kind of will appear when we're dealing with just individual nation states. So we've got these people who oftentimes will bring issues to the attention of certain governments, will often hold certain governments or institutional bodies accountable. Again, there is also included the individual sovereign states, and many of the institutions that have been created by the UN by legal bodies. There's very many ways to categorize these international environmental organizations, and I noticed that the IEOs, made up of countries working under a common specific goal, make for a better way of confronting these issues. So there is the UNESCO, FAO, all have a huge member rate. There's 195 member states in the United Nations organizations. And obviously these institutions that have so many member states hold a lot of ground because that's indicating that that many member states feel that they have some sort of vested interest in that issue. Going back to non-governmental groups, there is Greenpeace, Amnesty International, anything from broad to specialized. Again, these kind of fill in the gaps and make up kind of another element of players that are involved in how these issues are carried out on a global scale. I'm pretty sure that that's everything that I was planning on discussing in my midterm with you. I hope that I covered everything as well as I had hoped to. If you would like further clarification about any of the points that I talked to, I feel like I glossed over a few towards the end. Just let me know if you require any clarification. Thank you for watching.